People love this hospital.
There was just something about this place. It was warm, helpful.
I think it will be a tragedy if it's lost. I think that it's more than 100 years of history.
No, they can't take that away from me.
It's a place known to every West Australian family. Most would have been there for a couple of hours or for an extended stay, and most leave feeling better than when they arrived.
Looking after children and looking after their families is a privilege.
It's Western Australia's only children's hospital, a place trusted by Perth parents for over 105 years. But it's soon to take its very last patient.
It was a happy hospital. It was a great place.
To leave it, to me, is like leaving really part of me behind.
Next year, Princess Margaret Hospital's staff and patients will move to the new Perth Children's Hospital, and the local landmark will become a part of history.
There is at the moment a lot of emphasis on how wonderful the new hospital will be, and not enough emphasis on how very wonderful the old hospital was.
Unforgettable.
The Subiaco Children's Hospital opened in 1909, but the fundraising began 12 years earlier when a little girl dropped 3 pennies into the mouth of this money box.
The money box used to be in the Moore's store in town, and Mother and her young daughter were in the store, and the little girl was experimenting with her 3 pennies, putting them into the hand and then into the mouth. And when she'd spent her 3 pennies, she said to Mr. Moore, who happened to be passing by, she said, can I have my money back? And he said, no, I'm sorry. What would you like us to do with them when we retrieve them? And she said, give them to the Children's Hospital. And he said, but we have no children's hospital. Let's start one, and let's start with these 3 pennies.
Fellow department store owner Harry Bowen helped kick off the public appeal. Cots were made locally and conveyed by horse and cart up Murray Street. The hospital opened with 40 beds, a theatre block and small room for outpatients.
The first entry is on the 12th of July 1909.
Former nurse Jeanette Robertson leads the archives team and says some early admissions were for appendicitis and hernias.
Drain the wound, wash the wound out, close and hope that the child got better.
The utensils were crude.
A bone saw was used in amputation of limbs, sutures. These are surgical catgut, but also kangaroo tendons were used. Dennis Brown boots and bar were used to treat children with club feet. For bedwetters, we used the enuresis machine that gave a warning to the child to get out of bed as soon as the first moisture was felt. This is the original outpatients building.
Procedures were at times routine rather than necessity. Children would come to this weatherboard by the class load for tonsillectomies.
They used to line up along here and be taken into the operating room, and they used to come in here one by one and have their anaesthetic and their tonsils out, and then they would be recovered outside before going home on the tram. There's many stories about the children, from the children themselves, going home with the towels wrapped over their mouths as they sat on the tram wanting to be sick. We did have a man out in the front street that was hosing off the blood off the footpath.
Inpatients who couldn't walk were wheeled outside in their beds for their daily dose of vitamin D, or pushed to the purpose-built classroom constructed in the early 1940s.
Nurses in those days were virtually the unseen people who did the doctor's orders.
Maureen Callard started her training in 1944 when she says nurses were expected to be seen and not heard.
You never spoke to a senior. You never walked into a door before a senior. You didn't speak unless you were spoken to. You stood with your hands behind your back. Rules were rules and you kept to them.
Maureen nursed during the polio epidemic in the 1950s and regularly treated children with tetanus.
You never spoke in a loud voice in the room because they might trigger off spasms and things.
She recalls the introduction of life-saving penicillin and vaccines, and when, in 1949, the Children's Hospital took on the name of a much-esteemed royal.
We thought it was a step up in the world, that people knew who this hospital was. It wasn't just the kids' hospital. It was the Princess Margaret Hospital.
There was a story which circulated, and I'm not sure if it was true or not, that when she saw the intensive care unit, She looked around and said, "Where?" Which was a sign of exactly how small it was. A very perceptive lady, I think.
Dr Nerida Dilworth is the former head of Department of Anaesthesia.
We were reminiscing recently, and the first anaesthetic room that I used was in a linen cupboard, because before that the children were anaesthetised in theatre, and you can imagine how frightening that was.
Dr Dilworth was instrumental in changing the culture of care.
They certainly had been treated as little adults for many years. They just were rather noisy additions to an adult hospital usually.
She helped establish a paediatric surgical department and the hospital's first intensive care unit.
I loved it here. I think children were wonderful to work with. Their parents were nice, most of them anyway.
In the early days, visiting hours were restricted to just a couple of hours, 2 days a week.
Every Wednesday and every Sunday, people just swarmed in, mothers and fathers and siblings, although young children weren't allowed in. It was only children over 12, I think.
So young children weren't allowed to visit the children's hospital?
No, they might bring wogs in, coughs, colds, all those sort of things.
Those hours were relaxed in 1970, despite some grumbles.
I got the impression that a lot of the staff thought it would disrupt the wards too much, to have the parents coming and going when they wanted to.
So what's this building here?
This building is the old nurses' quarters, now the administration building.
Trainee nurses used to live on site. Friendships were forged, legends created.
We had a late pass, well, a so-called late pass until 10 o'clock, but of course nobody stuck to the late pass. So there was a hole in the fence and we used to crawl through it when we were late in. And one night the taxi driver asked the matron, did she want to go to the front door or did she want to go to the hole in the fence? After that, she knew about the hole in the fence and used to lay in wait with a bucket of water to tip over the girls that came in late.
I think at the time it was perfect for what we were doing.
Anne Burke has been the Executive Director of Nursing for 44 years and says the hospital's seen many modern touches, including to uniforms.
There was some research done that suggested that children were frightened of white uniforms, and so white uniforms have been removed over the years.
When Anne joined PMH in 1988, she wore canary yellow.
You stood out, that's for sure.
She says she misses aspects of her formative years.
I love my starched collars and cuffs.
Nowadays, most nursing staff wear user-friendly scrubs.
When we do move to the new hospital, we're looking at a brand new nurse's uniform, which will be based on colourful scrubs, I think. But we're going to ask the kids what they want.
Gone are the days of doctor knows best.
Families are much better educated and informed about their child's illness these days.
Dr Alan Duncan joined PMH in the mid-80s, despite some doubts about working with kids.
They were so small and so vulnerable. The equipment that we had in those days to look after small infants was pretty rudimentary.
In the 25 years Dr Duncan was head of ICU, the number of patients to the department more than doubled and infant mortality dropped to below 2%. Dr Duncan says it's been a team effort.
The cardiologists, cardiac surgeons, ear, nose and throat surgeons, spinal surgeons, all of those specialties contribute to the outcomes in the intensive care unit.
Dr Alan Duncan, Dr Nerida Dilworth, Anne Burke, Jeanette Robertson and Maureen Callard are among the many staff who've devoted their careers to Princess Margaret Hospital and who have laid the groundwork for a new era of paediatric care.
If you don't go with the changes, you get left behind. And some of the things that we've done here at PMH have been recognised throughout the world.
There's hardly a department in the hospital that hasn't made really positive advances.
How will you feel when it closes its doors?
A bit sad, but I think it's unnecessary.
It will be a wonderful thing to move into the new hospital. How exciting it is for the staff and how exciting it is for delivery of care.
Memories are made of this.